I arrived at the Vance estate on a stormy, torrential night. My hair was soaked, and my thin clothes clung freezing to my skin. I can't clearly recall who guided me through the front door, nor could I hear whose voice first introduced me to the room. All I knew was that as we crossed the threshold of that grand iron gate, I looked up and caught the warm yellow light spilling from a second-story window, where a solitary figure stood completely still. He was wearing his prep school uniform, a white Oxford shirt slightly wrinkled at the sleeves, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His face was entirely unreadable, as if he were simply watching the storm pass. But I knew his eyes were locked on me. I was 11 years old. My parents had just been killed in a head-on collision on an icy highway, leaving me without a single soul in the world. I had been brought here, to the home of my father's closest college friend. They told me I'd be staying temporarily, just until my school transfers went through and they could figure out the next steps. No one specified how long those next steps would take, and no one asked if I was terrified. During my first dinner at the Vance house, I sat at the very edge of the long mahogany dining table, facing the entire family: old Mr. Harold Vance, his wife, Eleanor, their son, Arthur, who was his father's business partner, and Arthur's son, Julian. The atmosphere was suffocatingly polite. I ate agonizingly slow, terrified to reach for the serving platters, keeping my head down and focusing entirely on my plain side of mashed potatoes. Whenever anyone asked me a question, I merely nodded or shook my head. I knew exactly where I stood in their hierarchy, neither a daughter nor a guest, just a stray child taken in out of obligation. Julian didn't utter a single word throughout the entire meal. He sat beside his father, eating mechanically, almost like a machine. I didn't dare stare, but I couldn't help but notice the watch on his wrist, a classic round face with a black leather strap. Later, I learned it was the last gift his mother had given him before she passed away. That watch would become an image burned into my mind for the rest of my life. During those first few weeks in the Vance house, I knew no one and spoke to no one. I slept in a cramped, drafty room right next to the basement storage area. Every single night, I pulled the heavy blankets completely over my head, terrified that if I let my guard down, I would dream of my parents. One afternoon, I came down with a low-grade fever. I didn't tell a soul because I was too frightened of being a burden. I crawled underneath my small desk, curling into a tight ball, and stayed there for hours as the afternoon faded into twilight. It was only after the family finished their dinner that someone finally opened my door and found me shivering uncontrollably. My face flushed bright red. It was Julian. He didn't say a word. He just knelt down and gathered me into his arms. I jolted in surprise, my cheeks burning hotter from embarrassment, but my body was too weak to fight back. As my head came to rest against his shoulder, the faint, clean scent of wintergreen soap enveloped me, bringing a strange, profound wave of peace. My eyes grew heavy. In my hazy, semi-conscious state, I heard his quiet voice, directing someone down the hall to bring up some medicine, adding that the girl had a fever. I don't know why, but a tiny smile crossed my lips in the dark. Maybe it was because it was the first time someone here had acknowledged my existence so gently. Julian was only a year older than me. At 12, he was already a full head taller, constantly distant, fiercely guarded, and he never smiled. Around the house, everyone whispered that he was the sole heir to the family legacy, that he had to be serious, that he had to be strong. Yet, absolutely no one knew that he was the one who had quietly left a wintergreen mint on my desk. It was my birthday, a day completely forgotten by everyone, including myself. But when I walked back from my new public school, there, it was a small green candy sitting precisely in the center of my math notebook. I lifted my eyes and saw that the window of the room directly opposite mine was cracked open. Julian was sitting at his desk reading a book, his back perfectly straight, his head slightly tilted, looking as though he hadn't moved an inch. I didn't say anything. I simply unwrapped the mint and popped it into my mouth. The cool, sweet burst of wintergreen rushed down my throat. That was the very first day I realized that in this massive house, I wasn't entirely invisible. On a late autumn afternoon, the sky opened up into a freezing downpour. I had just walked home from school, and before my coat could even begin to dry, the housekeeper scolded me sharply for leaving my wet sneakers on the hardwood floor of the entryway. I didn't argue. I just kept my head down, the damp air stinging my eyes as the cold wind whipped through my thin layers. I retreated to the covered patio by the side kitchen entrance, pulling my knees tightly against my chest. Just a few minutes later, a shadow fell over me. It was Julian. He was holding a large black umbrella. He didn't ask what was wrong, and he didn't offer any empty words of comfort. He just stood there, perfectly still, slanting the umbrella so that it shielded both me and the biting wind. I looked up, wanting desperately to thank him, but he had already turned on his heel. His silhouette faded into the gray rain, leaving me with a completely unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't just warmth, and it wasn't a simple schoolgirl crush. It was something much deeper, the realization that in this vast, alien world, someone actually saw me. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I lay wide awake beneath the covers, staring into the darkness, playing that exact moment over and over in my mind, the grip of his hand on the umbrella handle, the way his broad shoulders blocked the wind. For the very first time, I felt a sudden desire to stay in this place a little longer, simply because he was in it. I used to believe that if I just kept quiet enough, I could slip through life unnoticed. But in the end, it turned out that one person had been watching over me from the very start. Living in the Vance mansion felt like being an extra in a sprawling, high-stakes drama. Every person had a meticulously rehearsed role to play. The stoic, unreadable father, the elegant, poised grandmother, the endless stream of wealthy relatives who visited on weekends. And then there was me, a blurry background character with absolutely no lines, to the outside world. I was introduced as the daughter of a deceased family friend, an orphaned girl brought in under their roof out of charity. No one was cruel to me, truly. I had my own room. I was sent to school, and there was always a warm plate of food waiting for me at dinner. But that underlying feeling, the knowledge that you are stepping into someone else's perfect life as a charity case, is a heavy weight to carry. I did everything in my power to never cause trouble. I spoke only when spoken to, kept my room immaculate, and moved through the hallways like a ghost, leaving absolutely no trace of my existence. And just like that, 3 years blurred past. There was an unwritten, absolute rule in the Vance household. No one ever disrupted Julian. He was the eldest grandson, the golden child, the absolute pride of old Mr. Vance. His grades at the elite preparatory academy were flawless, his manners impeccable, his words precise and never wasted. Everyone sang his praises. But to me, he was intimidating. It wasn't that he was mean-spirited. On the contrary, he was incredibly quiet, rarely ever speaking directly to me. But it was that very silence that made me feel even more insignificant, as if I were standing at the base of a towering, unscalable wall. He never did anything to hurt me, but his mere presence commanded a room so completely that I barely dared to breathe when he was near. I grew accustomed to watching him from a distance. I watched him reading economics textbooks in the study, playing classical piano in the music room, and eating his meals with a disciplined, rhythmic precision. Julian belonged to an entirely different universe, a world of privilege and expectation that I was never meant to step into. Every single morning, a private driver in a sleek town car would pull up to take Julian to his private academy across town. I, on the other hand, walked down the block to catch the local transit bus to the public high school. I actually loved those morning bus rides. They were loud, chaotic, and crowded, but they made me feel normal. On that bus, I wasn't an outsider or a charity case. I was just another teenager heading to school. I threw myself into my schoolwork, not because I craved academic glory, but because I possessed an innate, terrifying understanding. If I wasn't useful or intelligent, no one would want me. I vividly remember the day I got a perfect score on a brutal advanced algebra exam. The teacher praised me in front of the whole class, and my peers looked at me with genuine awe. I brought the test paper home that evening and placed it neatly right next to my dinner plate, looking up with a quiet, hopeful expectation for a single word of validation from the adults. But nobody even glanced at it. Julian didn't either. He merely picked up his glass of water, excused himself from the table, and told the house manager that he would be studying late for his SATs. I wasn't angry, just hollowed out by a familiar sadness. But I quickly folded that disappointment away, tucking it into a locked drawer in my heart, where I kept all the things I would never share with another human soul. One evening, I was punished by the house manager. I had accidentally shattered a delicate crystal glass in the kitchen, a piece from Mrs. Vance's prized antique collection. The housekeeper scolded me thoroughly for my carelessness and told me to stand in the corner of the grand hallway for 10 minutes to reflect on my behavior. I didn't argue. I stood silently against the wall, staring up at the dazzling light refracting from the massive crystal chandelier above. Suddenly, I heard slow, measured footsteps. It was Julian. He didn't look at me as he walked by. His eyes focused straight ahead. But just a few seconds later, I felt the heavy fabric of a jacket gently draped over my shoulders. It was his charcoal gray school blazer, still warm from his body. I spun my head around. But he was already walking away down the long corridor without a word. That night, I fell asleep clutching that blazer tightly to my chest. The faint trace of wintergreen soap made me feel, if only for a moment, that I wasn't completely alone in the world. After that night, I began to notice the quiet, subtle details. A carton of the specific almond milk I liked, placed exactly on the refrigerator shelf I always checked. A classic novel wrapped carefully in brown paper left on my desk with a small, neatly typed note that read, "You should read this. It's a great story. Another time." I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat from a fever, only to find a fresh, cold washcloth resting on my forehead. It had clearly been changed multiple times while I slept. But the next morning, no one in the house claimed credit for it. I didn't ask. I just offered a silent thank you to the empty room. Perhaps he would never admit to it. Perhaps I would never possess the courage to call out his name in front of his family. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that in the middle of this cold, intimidating world, someone was quietly shielding me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. And it didn't have a name. It was just a steady gaze. A collection of tiny gestures. And the quiet, comforting reality of a boy named Julian Vance. I never quite noticed when the New England autumn fully set in, until I woke up one morning to find thick frost blanketing my bedroom window. My hands and feet were freezing, and a sudden, nameless ache bloomed in my chest. I remember that day with perfect clarity because it was the anniversary of my mother's passing. After the final bell rang, I walked home slowly, letting my feet drag along the pavement. My thin canvas sneakers quickly soaked through with rainwater, turning heavy and freezing. I hadn't brought an umbrella, and honestly, I didn't want one. I welcomed the biting chill as the water seeped down the collar of my sweater and pressed against my skin. That sharp discomfort was the only thing that made me feel alive. When I finally crossed the threshold of the Vance estate, the executive housekeeper was busy supervising the cleaning of the grand foyer. She frowned deeply the moment she saw me dripping water all over the floor, her voice sharp and echoing off the high ceilings. "Didn't you check the forecast before you left this morning? Look at the mess you're tracking onto the hardwood." I bowed my head, offering no excuse. I was completely used to it. Even though she wasn't inherently cruel, the tone of her voice always served as a harsh reminder that I was nothing more than an inconvenient object cluttering up their perfect home. I walked around to the side of the house, heading toward the covered patio by the kitchen entrance to kick off my ruined sneakers and dry off a bit before I was inevitably ordered upstairs to shower. The rain continued to fall in heavy, relentless sheets, and the wind blew the spray right under the awning, soaking my bangs. I curled into a tight ball, crouching down and wrapping my arms around my knees. My damp school shirt stuck to my back, making me shiver violently. I fully expected to sit there in the cold for hours, until a large shadow suddenly blocked the storm, and a black canopy appeared over my head. I looked up. It was him, Julian. His expression was exactly the same as it always was: calm, unreadable, and incredibly deep. It felt as though he had been standing there for a long time, just waiting for me to finally lift my head. He didn't speak. He just stood over me, his hand steady on the umbrella grip, keeping the driving rain from reaching me. I tried to force a word out, but my throat locked up completely. My heart, which had felt like a block of ice all morning, suddenly throbbed with a wave of intense warmth. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming heat. It was like someone placing a hot mug of cider in front of you on a freezing winter day. They don't force you to drink it, but just seeing it there is an act of pure kindness. I lowered my head again to hide the tears blurring my vision, burying my face in my knees. In that exact moment, I understood something fundamental about Julian Vance. He was never going to be the kind of person who would pull me into a dramatic embrace or comfort me with sweet, whispered promises, but he would stand right beside me in the freezing rain, holding an umbrella over my head. He wouldn't demand to know why I was crying. He wouldn't force me to stand up, and he wouldn't trespass on my grief. He would simply stay. I have never forgotten that afternoon. I never will. The following morning, I arrived at school much earlier than usual. Sitting on my desk was a simple, unmarked journal with a light brown canvas cover. There was no name or label on it anywhere. Inside, the pages were completely blank, except for a tiny post-it note attached to the first page that read, "For rainy days." There was no signature, but I knew instantly who had left it. He never needed to claim credit. It was enough that I understood, and I did. From that day forward, I began to write. It wasn't a melodramatic, Dear Diary type of journal. I just wrote a few honest lines every evening. Some days it was just a brief observation. The rain was freezing today. I wonder if he ate the carrots in his lunch. Even though he absolutely despises them, I miss my mom. Those messy, handwritten lines became the very first time I actually dared to speak to myself. And perhaps I only found the strength to write them because I knew that even if the rest of the world wasn't listening, he was quietly paying attention. A week later, the fever came back with a vengeance. My entire body felt like it was on fire. I lay paralyzed in my bed, unable to eat or speak, completely terrified of calling out for help. I was so deeply afraid of being perceived as an inconvenience to the family. As the sun went down and darkness filled my small room, I heard a very soft knock on my door. Before I could even manage to answer, the door creaked open. Julian stepped into the room, holding a glass of warm water and a couple of Tylenol pills. He set the glass down on my nightstand, looked down at me for a long, quiet moment, and said, "Take these. You need to get your fever down so you can make it to school tomorrow." I lay perfectly still, tears welling up in my eyes. No one had spoken to me like that since the accident. It was such a simple phrase, "so you can make it to school tomorrow," but it made me feel like I actually mattered. Like I had a definitive place in the world and a reason to look forward to the next day. I nodded weakly, took the medicine, and watched him quietly slip out of the room. There were no dramatic speeches, no tender touches. But my heart ached with a profound, terrifying realness. From that night on, I made a conscious effort to anchor myself to the tiny things. I remembered the exact rhythm of the rain on the patio awning. I remembered the clean scent of wintergreen that followed him. I remembered the silver trim on his black umbrella, and I held on to those words. "So you can make it to school tomorrow." I didn't realize back then that I was learning to survive by building a life out of memories of someone else. But that someone was Julian Vance, a boy who wasn't my brother, wasn't my family, and didn't have any official title in my life, but who was the first person to ever shield me from the storm. I was 12 and a half when I first experienced what it felt like to truly fall for someone. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or the dramatic, idealized love you read about in young adult novels. It was simply the feeling of being carried on someone's back under a fading amber sunset, feeling the steady strength of his shoulders, and realizing my heart was hammering wildly against my ribs. Julian carried me all the way home on an afternoon just like that. Our school had hosted an outdoor field day, and my entire class was required to participate in various sports and track events. I was never athletic, while trying to navigate a steep incline on the gravel path behind the bleachers. My ankle twisted violently beneath me, sending a sharp, blinding pain through my leg that left me completely unable to stand. My classmates scattered quickly, rushing off to the next event. And the teacher was completely preoccupied, dealing with another student who had suffered an allergic reaction. I was left entirely alone, curling into a tight ball against the chain-link fence, desperately trying to swallow my tears. No one noticed I was missing, and truthfully, I didn't want them to. I kept telling myself I could push through the pain and limp back on my own. Suddenly, a voice broke through the quiet. Maya. I snapped my head up. Julian was standing there in his gym clothes, a backpack slung over one shoulder, his face as calm and stoic as ever. He didn't ask why I was hiding, and he didn't lecture me for failing to notify a teacher. He simply turned around and bent down in front of me. Get on. I froze. I had never been carried like that before. When I was little, my father would always hold my hand as we walked, and my mother loved to wrap me in tight hugs. But a piggyback ride, a position where the person in front completely shields you from the wind, allowing the person in back to safely close their eyes and rest, was something I had never known. I hesitated, tearing at the grass. Julian turned his head slightly, his tone completely level. Your ankle is clearly messed up. If I don't carry you, are you planning on hopping all the way back to the main building? My face flushed crimson, realizing he was right. I awkwardly wrapped my arms around his shoulders, my palms trembling slightly against his shirt. He stood up effortlessly, hoisting me up as if I weighed absolutely nothing at all. I buried my face against his shoulder, listening to the chaotic rhythm of my own heart, a thick lump forming in my throat as my nose stung with unshed tears. I didn't cry, but the memory of that absolute safety remains vivid. It was a sense of security that I only ever felt when I was with Julian. He walked with slow, deliberate, steady steps. The autumn afternoon was dimming, crisp leaves dancing through the air around us, the scent of damp earth filling the space between us as his warm breath rose into the chilly air. I felt incredibly small and vulnerable. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was helping out as a student leader for the freshman events. He murmured quietly after a long silence. I noticed you weren't in line with the rest of your class. I nodded against his shoulder but didn't say a word, my fingers tightening slightly on the fabric of his shirt. Julian didn't push for conversation. The silence that stretched between us didn't feel like a vast canyon anymore. It felt like a comfortable blanket. When we finally reached the house, his grandmother noticed my badly swollen, bruised ankle. She was about to call for one of the house staff to fetch an ice pack and bandages. But Julian immediately intervened. I've got it. He brought down the heavy first aid kit from the upstairs bathroom and carefully cleaned the scrapes on my leg. His touch was incredibly gentle, though I still winced slightly from the sharp sting. Hold still, he murmured softly. If we don't wrap this tightly right now, the swelling is going to get much worse by tomorrow. I bit my lip hard and nodded. He sat on the floor directly in front of me, resting on one knee, his head bowed as he meticulously wrapped my ankle in clean, white athletic tape. I stared down at the stray locks of hair falling across his forehead, the sharp line of his jaw, and his thick eyelashes. It struck me then how strikingly handsome he was. He possessed the kind of beauty that made it difficult to look at him directly, because if you stared for too long, your heart would completely stop listening to reason. That evening, I opened my canvas journal again. He carried me home today. I can still remember the scent of his clothes like wintergreen and crisp autumn air. My heart was beating so fast. But for once, it wasn't because I was scared. I closed the notebook and held it, pressed tightly against my chest for a long time. I had fallen completely in love with him. It wasn't a possessive, demanding kind of love. I just wanted to be allowed to stand by his side. I wanted a day to come when I would be older, stronger, and worthy enough to reach out and hold his hand without trembling. But deep down, I knew the reality. I was nobody. I wasn't a Vance. I didn't attend a prestigious private academy. And old Mr. Vance never looked at me with pride or high expectations. I was just a charity case taken in because of a promise made between two men who were no longer alive. So, I buried those feelings deep inside my chest quietly, secretly, expecting absolutely nothing in return. I didn't need him to know. I only needed to be allowed to watch him from afar, like a faint, beautiful light shining through the darkness I had grown so accustomed to. Julian never used my name when we were around his family. If he needed to get my attention, he would simply say, "Hey," or look directly at me. But I overheard him on the phone once, speaking to his school counselor regarding an afternoon commitment. "I need to request an extension on my project layout," he had said, his voice dropping slightly. Maya Carter twisted her ankle at the field day, and I had to make sure she got home safely. That was the very first time I heard him say my full name. I sat alone in my room, clutching a glass of milk, as hot tears silently slipped down my cheeks. It was such a completely ordinary sentence. But to a girl living in a house on borrowed warmth, it was more precious than any grand declaration of love. I grew up on those tiny crumbs of kindness, a shared umbrella in a downpour, a fever broken in the dark, a tightly wrapped ankle, and the sound of my name spoken to a stranger on the other end of a phone line. My 12-year-old heart didn't break because someone promised me the world. It woke up because one person chose to stay. Julian left on a brutally cold, bitter winter morning. There was no cinematic goodbye for me. No final, lingering look. No parting promise that he would eventually come back. I stood hidden behind the curtains of my second-story window, watching the sleek black SUV pull away from the Vance estate. He sat in the back seat, his profile sharp and his spine perfectly straight, looking as though he were entirely accustomed to walking away from things without looking back. He was heading off to an elite university program in the United Kingdom, a path meticulously mapped out by his grandfather. The entire Vance family practically radiated pride, an international business fellowship with a full ride at Oxford. I heard his father boast at breakfast. The boy truly never fails to impress, just like his grandfather when he went over there. I listened to every single word from the hallway. Each exclamation felt like a tiny, precise cut against my heart. No one asked how I felt about his departure. Of course they didn't. Why would they? I was just a background character in their lives. A ghost living in their guest house. No one considers telling a ghost that the young master is leaving, or asking if she wants to say goodbye. I thought the tears would come, but my eyes remained completely dry. There was only a dull, deep, echoing ache in my chest, the kind of pain that only you can hear. After he left, the Vance estate felt entirely vacant. The grand piano remained closed every afternoon. The heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway disappeared, and his polished dress shoes no longer sat neatly by the front door. I continued my life exactly as before, eating meals on schedule, maintaining perfect attendance at school, studying late into the night. But there was one major change. I stopped writing in the canvas journal. I wrapped the notebook up and slid it into the very back of my bookshelf, buried beneath old textbooks. I told myself that it was over. He was gone, and I still had a life to build. Time moved forward with a quiet, monotonous rhythm. I entered my public high school years, never requesting the elite resources Julian had enjoyed, choosing instead to remain entirely low profile. I never complained or asked for more. I understood my place. I was still living under the Vance roof. Still, the orphan, staying there out of historical obligation. They treated me with a distant, polite respect, but no one ever truly tried to get to know me, and I certainly didn't invite them to. I was terrified of growing accustomed to someone holding an umbrella over me again, only to watch them walk away. During my sophomore year, I started picking up freelance digital illustration gigs for a small indie comic studio online. Every night after completing my homework, I would sit up until the early hours of the morning drawing on my tablet. My back would ache and my fingers would go numb, but my mind felt incredibly light. When I was drawing, I finally had a voice. I didn't have to read the room, analyze anyone's expression, or carefully guard my words. On that digital canvas, I was entirely free. During Sunday brunch one weekend, old Mr. Vance looked across the table at me. "So, Maya, what are your plans for college?" I kept my voice even. "I'm applying to the Rhode Island School of Design. I want to major in illustration." The entire table went dead silent. After a long pause, Arthur Vance let out a dry, dismissive chuckle. "Art school. Well, I suppose that's fine, as long as you aren't expecting this family to foot the bill for a hobby." I nodded calmly. "I don't expect anything. I've already been offered a merit scholarship, and my freelance work covers the rest." I had grown completely accustomed to carrying the weight of my own life. Ever since the day Julian left, I had developed a solitary, strange habit. Every now and then, I would walk up to the second floor and stand precisely at the window where he had stood the night I first arrived. I looked down at the courtyard for a few minutes. The grounds never changed. But I had changed completely. I was no longer the helpless, terrified 11-year-old girl who had lost everything. I knew how to take care of myself, how to nurse my own illnesses, and how to pack away my own sorrows. But there was one thing I still hadn't mastered: forgetting him. I could still feel the phantom weight of his blazer on my shoulders. I could still see the glass of water he placed on my nightstand. I could still feel the steady strength of his shoulders carrying me through the autumn leaves. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They just felt incredibly real. Real enough that some nights I would wake up abruptly and glance toward the door, half expecting to see him leaning against the frame. But the space was always empty. I never tried to contact him. I didn't have his international number. And I didn't follow his professional social media accounts. I didn't dare ask for them. And I didn't dare hope he would look for me. I only gathered fragments of his life through the casual remarks his grandmother made at the dinner table. He was graduating at the top of his class. He had landed a prestigious analyst position at a major private equity firm in Manhattan. He was planning to return to the States to launch his own venture. Every single time his name was spoken, my heart would give a sudden, violent throb, a tiny, localized earthquake. But I never allowed it to shatter me. I had to keep moving forward, because there was no one standing behind me to block the wind anymore. And I refused to remain a shadow. I wanted a day to come where, if our paths ever crossed again, I could look him dead in the eye, not as his family's charity case, but as myself, Maya Carter, a woman who had learned to stand entirely on her own 2 feet. I crossed paths with Julian again on a crisp, brilliant spring afternoon in Boston. Just as the city was shaking off the winter chill and the cherry blossoms were beginning to blanket the sidewalks of Commonwealth Avenue, I was still living my life quietly, like a small plant pushing through the pavement to reach the sunlight. There was no warning, no sudden text message, no alignment of the stars, signaling that he was back in the country. He simply appeared, mirroring the exact suddenness of that rainy autumn afternoon years ago. Except this time, I wasn't the broken little girl cowering beneath the kitchen awning. An older colleague from my design firm had asked me to help out with event photography for a high-profile venture capital summit downtown. I accepted the gig solely for the generous weekend pay and a bit of curiosity. The corporate finance world felt incredibly distant and gilded compared to my life of sketchbooks and camera lenses. The grand ballroom was packed with sharply dressed executives. I was standing near the back, adjusting my camera's focal length when the announcer's voice echoed through the microphone. And to conclude our opening panel, please welcome the founder and CEO of Vanguard Capital, Julian Vance. My entire body locked up. It was a name I had whispered into the dark for so many years that every single syllable was permanently etched into my soul. The man who walked onto the stage was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit with a slate gray tie. He was tall, commanding, and possessed an absolute, unshakable calm in his eyes. It was the exact same gaze, the same sharp brow, the same striking profile, and that deep, resonant voice that spoke with immense precision. I couldn't take a single photo. My hands were shaking so violently against the camera body, and my heart was beating even harder. We were truly in the same room again. After all this time, I didn't run away, and I didn't try to push through the crowd. I simply stood at the very back of the auditorium, my fingers white as I gripped the camera strap, watching the boy who used to silently hold an umbrella over me stand before hundreds of the country's top investors, radiating absolute confidence and authority. No one in that room knew that the man speaking about long-term market sustainability and growth had once carried a forgotten orphan girl on his back through the autumn leaves. No one knew but me. The moment the panel concluded, I began frantically packing up my gear, desperate to escape before the networking hour commenced, either to avoid an awkward confrontation or out of a desperate fear that my carefully built resolve would crumble. But just as I stepped through the heavy side exit doors into the quieter corridor, a voice cut through the ambient noise behind me. Maya. I froze instantly. Hearing those 2 syllables spoken by that specific voice sent a violent shockwave through me, dragging every single buried memory straight to the surface. I turned around slowly. Julian was standing a few feet away. He was no longer the silent, a distant teenager I had grown up with. He was a grown man, and his eyes held a warmth that caught me completely off guard. "It really is you," he murmured. I offered a small, Tentative nod, caught between a smile and the instinct to look down at the floor. We just stood there, studying each other, neither of us rushing to break the silence. The city outside was humming with traffic. But in that hallway, it felt as though time had ground to a complete halt, waiting for the first real word to be spoken. "I didn't recognize you from across the room at first," he said, his voice low. "You've changed so much." I forced a soft smile. "Well, it's been a while. A lot happens in 6 years." 6 years, he repeated quietly. "I've been back in the States for exactly 3 days." I looked down at the tips of my boots. "You still remember the timeline?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a few deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between us until he was standing close enough for me to hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. I never forgot. My chest tightened sharply, a bittersweet rush of emotion flooding my system. A part of me had been waiting to hear those words for a lifetime. We ended up walking out of the venue together, moving slowly down a historic, tree-lined street where pink petals were drifting through the air like snow. We didn't talk much, just maintaining a shared stride, as if the 6-year void between us didn't exist at all. "What did you end up studying?" he inquired gently. "Digital illustration and design," I replied. "I do freelance concept work and commercial branding now." "Your own choice." I nodded. "Your own choice. No one makes decisions for me anymore." Julian went quiet, but his eyes were filled with a heavy weight of unspoken thoughts. "And what about you?" I asked, turning the question back to him. "Are you back for good?" He nodded once. "Yeah, I'm establishing our main corporate office right here in the city." I pressed my lips together and looked away, the spring breeze chilling my fingertips. "So, we're living in the same city again." He didn't reply immediately. He stopped walking, turning his body fully toward me. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Maya, I'm so sorry." I jolted slightly at the sudden intensity in his voice. "Sorry for what?" "For leaving the way I did without saying goodbye. For leaving you to grow up all by yourself in that house." I hadn't expected him to carry that memory, let alone feel a sense of guilt over it. I shook my head, offering a gentle smile. "Julian, it's okay. Seriously. I turned out completely fine. I know you're fine. Because you've always been incredibly strong," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. It was the exact same intense, protective look he had given me under the umbrella, but now it was laced with the maturity of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. "But if I could go back to that morning, I would have forced myself to tell you one thing." "What?" Julian stepped closer, his eyes refusing to let go of mine. "That I would come back for you, and that if you were willing to wait, I would spend every day looking for you." I stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, my fingers gripping the strap of my camera bag until they went numb. It wasn't from the cold, but because my heart was beating so fiercely I thought it might burst through my chest. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Just standing there beside him in the fading afternoon light with the cherry blossoms falling around us was enough. It was enough to know that the quiet, secret bond we had forged in childhood hadn't faded at all. It had simply been waiting for the right season, the right moment, and the right gaze to wake it back up. After that afternoon, I rationalized that we probably wouldn't see each other again anytime soon. Boston is a massive, sprawling city, home to millions of busy souls. There are people you can spend an entire lifetime searching for and never find. And then there are the people who don't require searching at all because they simply anchor themselves to your universe. Julian turned out to be the latter. We crossed paths again just 3 days later, inside the small, independent coffee shop I frequented every single morning before work in the South End. I walked up to the counter and placed my usual order, a hot oat milk latte. Half sweet, no ice. The cafe was exceptionally quiet that morning, with only a few tables occupied. I took my drink, sat down at a small table in the back, and opened my sketchbook. I had only managed to rough out a few lines of a new landscape when the barista walked over, setting a small plate with a fresh pastry on my table. Looking a bit amused, the gentleman in the corner asked me to bring this over and give you his regards. I snapped my head up, completely bewildered, about to ask who she was talking about, when a familiar, deep voice resonated from the back booth. I had a feeling I'd find you here. And I see you still order your lattes half sweet. I turned my head. Julian was sitting in the furthest corner of the shop, his tailored charcoal suit jacket draped over the back of the leather booth, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms, a single espresso cup resting in front of him. The sight of him in that ordinary space felt entirely surreal. I stood up, holding my sketchbook, a mixture of shock and amusement bubbling up inside me as I walked over to his table. "What are you doing here?" He set his espresso down, a genuine, rare smile breaking across his features. "I think I should be asking you that. Is this your regular spot?" "Every single morning," I admitted. "It's usually quiet." "Exactly why I chose it," he replied softly. We locked eyes for a long beat. Neither of us stated the obvious truth hanging in the air. But the silent understanding was absolute. It wasn't a coincidence. And it wasn't just fate. One of us had intentionally woken up much earlier just to sit and wait. From that morning on, Julian became a constant, anchoring presence in my everyday life. In the beginning, it started with those seemingly accidental morning run-ins at the coffee shop. Then, it evolved into brief. In Paulette text a message sent to my phone. "Are you planning on dropping by the cafe this morning? I want to make sure I don't accidentally take the window seat you like." I rarely replied with anything detailed. But every single time I opened the door to that shop, he was there. He never crowded me, never tried to force his way into my personal space, and never demanded my attention. He simply stayed in his corner, working on his laptop. A quiet, protective presence that mirrored the boy who used to hold an umbrella over me without needing to say a word. On a Friday, a few weeks later, I ended up staying late at the design studio to finish a major client presentation. By the time I stepped out onto the street, a massive spring thunderstorm had rolled in, turning the evening pitch black and flooding the gutters. The subway station down the block was absolute chaos, packed with crowds of stranded commuters trying to shield themselves from the driving rain. The moment I stepped past the glass doors of my office building, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Julian. "I see you still haven't broken the habit of leaving the house without an umbrella." I lifted my eyes, fully expecting my mind to be playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. Julian was standing just a few yards away at the edge of the sidewalk, a large black umbrella held steady in his right hand, his eyes locked onto mine through the sheets of falling water. He looked exactly like the 12-year-old boy from the patio, except this time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't hide. And I didn't let the fear of being a burden keep me frozen in the shadows. I took a deep breath, stepped out into the storm, and ran straight toward him.